Hey everyone, welcome to Darkened Echo. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The attic was colder than the rest of the house. Dust floated in the air like tiny white insects, stirred only by the weak light of Ethan's flashlight. He had been cleaning his late father's belongings for hours. Boxes filled with tax papers, books with broken spines, and old photographs where faces had faded into pale smudges. Nothing had stood out. Nothing had felt important. Until he found the key. It was buried under a stack of yellowed letters bound by twine. The letters were damp, the ink nearly erased by time, but the key was untouched, gleaming faintly despite the decades of neglect. Ethan lifted it carefully, the weight surprising him. It wasn't like an ordinary house key. This one was long, brass, its shaft engraved with curling patterns that looked almost like veins. The head of the key bore a single symbol. A circle, broken down the middle by a jagged line, as if it had been split in two. Attached to it was a cracked leather tag. On one side, written in a hurried scrawl, were 3 words that raised every hair on the back of his neck. Do not return. Ethan stared at it for a long time, the key pressing cold into his palm. Return where? His father had never spoken about places he'd forbidden, never warned him away from anywhere. His father was a man of silence, of rules and order. If he wanted Ethan away from something, he never said it. He just avoided it altogether. But Ethan remembered one thing. Whenever they drove past Willow Creek Road, his father's hands tightened on the steering wheel. His eyes locked forward, refusing to glance left where the road disappeared into the trees. Ethan had been a child then, curious but never bold enough to ask. Now he thought he knew. Willow Creek Road, the house at the end. The one his grandmother used to whisper about when she thought no one was listening. The house that waited. Ethan swallowed hard, turning the key over. His pulse hammered. He should have put it back. He should have locked the box and shoved it into storage. But the thought gnawed at him. Why would his father keep the key to a place they never visited? By evening, the thought had grown unbearable. At midnight, when the world was still, Ethan found himself standing at the edge of Willow Creek Road. The trees bent and toward each other, their branches clawing at the black sky. The air smelled of damp leaves and something else, something metallic like old blood. The house rose at the end of the road, half hidden by shadow. Its roof sagged, shingles missing, windows broken or darkened. It looked like a corpse of a mansion, its skeleton standing long after life had abandoned it. Yet as Ethan stood at the rusted gate, staring at the ruin, he felt no peace from its emptiness. Instead, he felt watched. The black windows weren't broken eyes. They were open ones. The key in his pocket burned cold. He pushed the gate. It wailed against its hinges, swinging open to reveal a path nearly eaten by weeds. The crunch of gravel beneath his shoes echoed far too loud in the silence, as though the earth itself listened. Halfway to the porch, the air shifted. The ground seemed to sink beneath his feet, as if the soil wanted to pull him in. He froze, heart hammering. It was only his imagination. It had to be. The porch groaned as he placed his foot on the first step. Then the front door, swollen and weather-worn, creaked inward. No wind pushed it. No hand touched it. Ethan's mouth went dry. And then, a sound, a faint, rasping whisper, carried from the darkness inside the house. A voice so thin it seemed part of the air itself. Welcome back. Ethan's blood turned to ice. His throat closed. Back. He had never been here before. Slowly, his hand reached into his pocket, pulling out the brass key. His fingers shook violently, but not only from fear. When he saw the symbols up close again, something inside him recognized them. Not in his mind, but in his bones, as though the memory wasn't his, but lived inside him anyway. For the first time in his life, Ethan was afraid not of the house, but of himself. Ethan stood frozen on the porch, staring at the cracked door. His body begged him to leave, but his legs refused to move. That whisper, thin, rasping, yet unmistakably directed at him, still lingered in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Welcome back. His breath misted in the cold night. The sound of the woods around him, crickets, the occasional owl, had gone silent. The only thing he could hear now was the faint creak of the door, swaying slightly, as though it were breathing. Ethan's knuckles whitened around the brass key. Something about holding it made him feel tethered to the house, as though he couldn't simply walk away. His chest tightened. What if he dropped it here right now? What if he left it at the gate, turned around, and never came back? But something inside whispered louder than the wind, "You won't." He reached forward, placing a trembling hand on the door. It felt colder than the air, the wood slick beneath his palm. With the slightest push, it swung inward on hinges that should have rusted shut decades ago. The smell hit him instantly. Not dust or mold like he expected, but something sweet and rotting, like spoiled fruit left in the sun. He gagged, covering his mouth, but his flashlight beam forced him deeper. The entryway was wide, the remnants of a once grand staircase rising toward the second floor. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, revealing wood blackened with damp. Portraits still hung crooked on the walls, faces obscured by grime. Their eyes, dark hollows, cobwebs, draped the ceiling like funeral veils. Yet there was no dust on the floor. Ethan frowned. He aimed his flashlight down, expecting decades of debris, but the wooden boards were bare, polished almost, reflecting a faint shine under the beam. His heartbeat quickened. Someone, or something, had been keeping this place clean. Then he noticed the door to the right, half open, as though inviting him in. His throat tightened. The beam of light wavered as he turned toward it, the brass key still burning cold in his hand. A whisper slid out of the darkness again. "You remember the way." Ethan's knees nearly buckled. He swung the light wildly, pointing it into the living room. Shadows leapt across broken furniture, across the fireplace choked with ash, across curtains that seemed to move on their own. But the room was empty. The voice hadn't come from the living room at all. It had come from behind him. Ethan whipped around, the flashlight jerking across the staircase. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw something on the landing above. A figure standing completely still, pale as chalk, its head tilted unnaturally far to one side. The light flickered. When the beam steadied, the landing was empty. Ethan staggered backward, his chest heaving. He had to leave. Now. But as he turned toward the front door, his stomach dropped. The door was closed. Not just closed, but locked. He rushed forward, yanking the handle with both hands. It didn't budge. Panic clawed up his throat. He pulled the key from his pocket and shoved it at the lock, desperate. But the brass key didn't fit. It wasn't meant for the front door. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Something was moving. Ethan pressed his back against the door, his breath sharp and shallow. The sound of footsteps spread slowly across the upper floor, each step measured, deliberate, heavy like something large dragging its weight across the boards. Then, silence. The house held its breath. And in that silence, Ethan heard it again. A whisper, closer this time. Come back to where it began. The brass key in his hand pulsed like a heartbeat. The silence pressed against Ethan's ears until it felt like a physical weight. He didn't dare breathe too loudly, afraid the sound might draw attention to him. The key was still cold in his palm, pulsing faintly, as if it wanted him to move forward, not out of the house, but deeper inside. The rational part of his mind screamed to leave, to smash a window, to break down the door, to run until the house was nothing but a nightmare behind him. But his legs betrayed him. Slowly, almost against his will, they carried him toward the staircase. Each step groaned under his weight. The flashlight trembled in his hand, the beam skittering across the peeling wallpaper, the jagged cracks in the ceiling, and the mounted portraits whose faces seemed to lean closer as he passed. Their eyes were blurred by decay, yet he felt them following him, judging him for returning when he had been warned to stay away. At the top of the staircase, the air shifted. It was colder, heavier, filled with the faint smell of smoke, though no fire had burned here in decades. The hall stretched ahead, lined with closed doors. Each one seemed to lean slightly inward, as though listening. Ethan's throat tightened. He swept the flashlight across the hall, and for a split second his breath caught. A door at the far end was open, just a crack. Every other door was sealed shut, but that one waited. His heart hammered in his chest. He should have turned back. He should have ignored it. But his hand, trembling as though guided by someone else, slid the key into his pocket and gripped the flashlight tighter. Step by step, he moved down the hall. His shoes tapped softly against the wood, each sound echoing louder than it should have. He paused halfway, the silence crushing in on him. Then, thump. Ethan froze. The sound came from the closed door to his right. He pressed himself against the wall, heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. Thump. This time louder, closer, like something large pressing against the other side of the door. The doorknob twitched. Ethan's hand flew to the key in his pocket. It was burning now, searing his palm, but when he pulled it out, he realized something. The faint glow from its engravings was pulsing in rhythm with the thumps from behind the door. Thump. The walls seemed to shudder. Ethan stumbled backward, eyes locked on the door. But before he could run, the thumping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. A breath hissed through the keyhole. Not that one. Keep going. Ethan staggered, his body breaking out in cold sweat. His mind screamed, "Who is speaking? How do they know I'm here?" But against all reason, his legs carried him further down the hall, toward the half-open door. The key glowed brighter, urging him. As he reached the door, he paused. The crack was wide enough to see a sliver of the room beyond. A child's bedroom, frozen in time. A small bed pressed against the far wall, toys scattered across the floor, wallpaper decorated with faded stars. The air smelled of dust and something faintly sweet like old perfume. Ethan reached out, pushing the door slowly. It opened with a low moan, revealing the room in full. His flashlight beams swept across it, landing on something that made his stomach twist. On the bed lay a small, neatly folded dress. The fabric was pristine, untouched by time, and on top of it, a photograph. Ethan stepped closer, his hand trembling as he lifted it. It was a picture of a boy, no older than 7, wide-eyed, pale, with hair that looked eerily familiar. The boy was him. Ethan's hand shook so violently the photograph nearly slipped from his grip. His mind screamed for reason, for an explanation that made sense. But the truth stared back at him from the faded paper. The boy in the photograph was unmistakably him. The same round eyes, the same faint scar above the eyebrow from when he fell off his bike at 7 years old. But that wasn't possible. He had never been in this house before. His family never spoke of it, never acknowledged it existed. Yet here, in a child's bedroom that looked untouched by time, lay undeniable proof. The air in the room felt heavier now, pressing on his chest. The key burned against his palm, glowing faintly brighter, as if feeding on his confusion. He set the photograph back on the folded dress, whispering aloud though no one was there. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But the room answered. The toys scattered across the floor rattled softly, one by one, as though touched by invisible hands. A wooden horse rolled a few inches. A small drum thumped a single hollow note. Ethan froze, his pulse screaming in his ears. And then he heard it. A giggle, high-pitched, childlike, but wrong. It echoed softly through the room, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Ethan whipped his flashlight around, the beam catching corners, toys, the ceiling, but no one was there. The sound made his skin crawl, as though the walls themselves were laughing. He stumbled back toward the hall, but just as his foot touched the doorway, the giggle stopped. Silence swallowed the room, and in that silence came a voice, not whispered, not faint, but clear, low, and close to his ear. "Why did you leave me here?" Ethan spun around, the flashlight beam cutting across the bed. His breath caught. The photograph was gone. In its place, the dress had unfolded itself, spread across the bed as though worn by an invisible body. The sleeves sagged downward, the skirt stretched outward, like someone small and unseen sat patiently in the center of the mattress. The key seared his hand. He nearly dropped it, but something kept his grip tight, as though the metal itself refused to let go. Suddenly, the walls of the room groaned, the sound reverberating through the floorboards. The ceiling creaked, dust drifting down like falling ash. Ethan bolted for the hallway, gasping for air as he stumbled out of the child's bedroom and slammed the door shut behind him. The hall was darker than before. His flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker as though the house itself drained the power. And then, from somewhere further down the hall, he heard it again. A voice, distorted and stretched. Come back to where it began. Ethan clutched the key, staring down the corridor. The open door had vanished. Now all the doors were closed again, identical, waiting. Except one. At the very end of the hall, barely visible in the dim light, a door stood slightly ajar. Not a bedroom this time. This one was heavier, taller, built differently from the others. A faint draft of cold air seeped from the crack, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and stone. Ethan's chest tightened. It wasn't another bedroom. It wasn't part of a home at all. It was a door that led downward, toward a basement. The key pulsed harder in his hand, demanding, insistent, alive. And in that moment, Ethan understood something he didn't want to admit. The key wasn't guiding him. It was calling him. The hallway stretched before Ethan like the throat of some ancient beast, swallowing the weak glow of his flashlight. Every step he took groaned through the warped floorboards, echoing unnaturally, as if the sound was not just traveling through the house, but through something deeper beneath it. The slightly open door at the end of the corridor called to him. Cold air slipped through the crack, brushing against his face like damp fingers. With every step closer, his skin prickled as though unseen eyes crawled along his back. He reached the door. Its frame was heavier, carved from darker wood than the others, warped with age. The brass handle was tarnished, coated in a thin layer of grime. And yet, the key in his hand pulsed brighter, like it had been waiting. His throat tightened. The thought crept uninvited into his mind. This isn't the first time you've stood here. Ethan's hand trembled as he fit the key into the lock. It turned too smoothly, too eagerly, as if the door had been unlocked all along. The hinges screamed as he pushed it open. A stairwell descended into darkness. The smell hit him immediately, damp, earthy, with a metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. The air was colder here, wet and heavy, pulling each breath slow and shallow. His flashlight flickered as though reluctant to shine, its beam falling on uneven stone steps slick with moisture. For a moment, Ethan hesitated at the top, his instincts screaming to run, but his body betrayed him. One step forward, then another. His feet moved as though compelled, like strings pulled by something unseen. The door slammed shut behind him. He flinched, spinning back, but the stairwell swallowed the sound whole, leaving only silence. The flashlight beam trembled across the walls. Strange markings etched into the stone glistened faintly, curling in patterns that seemed almost alive. The longer Ethan looked, the more they shifted, as if writhing under his gaze. Halfway down, he stopped. There was again the giggle, but this time it wasn't distant. It wasn't scattered. It came from directly below. The beam of his flashlight shook violently in his hands, catching glimpses of things he couldn't explain. Shadows moving where there was no space to move, faint outlines pressed against the stone as though faces strained to push through. The air thickened. His chest ached as though the atmosphere itself resisted his breathing. And then he reached the bottom. The basement stretched out like a cavern, much larger than the house above should have allowed. The walls were jagged stone, slick with water, glowing faintly in places where the markings continued to cross their surfaces. The floor was uneven, scattered with old, broken furniture, rusted tools, and shards of glass. And in the center stood something that froze Ethan's blood. An old wooden chair. On it, bound by ropes that looked freshly tightened, lay another photograph. With a trembling hand, Ethan stepped forward and picked it up. His vision swam as the image came into focus. It was the same bedroom upstairs, but this time, the boy in the photograph wasn't just sitting on the bed. He was staring directly at Ethan. His own eyes, his own face, but distorted, hollow, and older. His mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. Ethan staggered back, the photo slipping from his grip. The key in his palm grew unbearably hot, searing into his skin. He gasped, But no matter how he tried, he couldn't drop it. And then the chair creaked, slowly, as if something unseen had just sat down. From the shadows of the far end of the cavern, movement stirred. A shape unfolded itself from the stone, its limbs too long, its face blurred and shifting, sometimes a stranger's, sometimes Ethan's own. It crawled forward, joints snapping, body contorting in ways no living thing should. And when it spoke, the sound wasn't a voice. It was every voice Ethan had ever known, layered into one. "You came back, just like you promised." Ethan stumbled backward, heart hammering. His mind screamed to run, but his body stayed frozen, rooted to the wet stone floor. The figure stretched closer, its shadow swallowing his own. And with every step it took, the key pulsed brighter, as if it belonged to it, not to him. Ethan's breath clouded in the freezing air, shallow and ragged. The figure's body bent at impossible angles, its every motion scraping against stone like nails across glass. Its presence pressed against his skull, not just seen but felt, burrowing into his thoughts like roots breaking through soil. The key burned brighter in his palm, pulsing in rhythm with the creature's approach. His skin blistered, but no matter how he screamed inside his mind, his hand would not release it. "You came back," the voice whispered again, except this time, the sound was inside his chest, reverberating through his bones. "Just like you promised." Ethan's lips trembled. I don't know what you mean. I don't know you." The figure tilted its head, and for a fleeting instant, its blurred features sharpened. Ethan staggered backward as he saw his own face reflected in its skin, but not as he was now. It was him as a child, pale, frightened, a boy of maybe 10 years old, eyes sunken and wide. The memory slammed into him without warning. He was small again, his hands sticky with dirt as he played near the forest that edged his childhood home. He remembered wandering too far. The world had grown darker under the canopy. His young voice had called out, desperate for someone to hear. And then the house. It had stood there even then, hidden between the trees, sagging yet watchful. A door had opened, and something inside had beckoned him closer. "Play with me, just once. Promise you'll come back." The whisper from the dark hallways had been sweet, almost gentle, and Ethan, frightened and lonely, had nodded. He had stepped inside, clutching a small brass key given to him by the shadows. The rest of the memory fractured, his mother's scream, a frantic search, and then blankness. He had never remembered what happened after that day, until now. The creature crouched lower, its limbs bending backward, face flickering between strangers and Ethan's own younger self. "You left, but promises bind deeper than blood." The photograph on the chair curled at its edges, sizzling in unseen heat. Ethan's flashlight flickered and died, leaving only the faint phosphorescent glow of the wall markings. Their shifting patterns writhed faster, crawling toward him, snaking across the floor like veins. He stumbled back against the damp wall, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The house had been waiting, not for just anyone, not for another curious soul. It had been waiting for him. The creature drew closer, the air around it warping with each step. Ethan's knees buckled under its weight, though it hadn't yet touched him. "This house has one rule," it whispered, 1,000 voices layering into one. "What is given must be kept. What is promised must return." The walls pulsed with the words, as if the entire cavern repeated them. Ethan's voice cracked. "I was a child. I didn't know what I was doing." The figure leaned closer, its inverted face inches from his own. Its breath was cold enough to burn. Children speak the truest vows, and the house remembers. The key in Ethan's palm grew unbearably hot until it seared into his skin, branding its jagged outline. He screamed, dropping to his knees, the echo torn from his throat swallowed whole by the cavern. From the far corners of the chamber, more shadows shifted. Figures pressed out from the stone walls, blurred faces watching, whispering in voices that sounded achingly familiar. Friends, family, people long gone. Their words tangled into a chorus. "Stay, stay, stay." Ethan clutched his head, sobs breaking past his teeth. He understood now. The house hadn't merely chosen him. It owned him, and it wasn't going to let him leave. Ethan pressed his back against the damp wall, gasping for air as the whispers swelled louder, overlapping until they blurred into a suffocating roar. The glowing runes on the stone floor pulsed brighter, their lines twisting into a spiral that coiled around him. He realized with mounting horror that he was standing at its center. The distorted figure loomed closer, its upside-down face now flickering between Ethan's younger self and something older, hollow-eyed, almost corpse-like. Every time its features shifted, Ethan caught flashes of other faces, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, children, women, men, their mouths wide in silent screams. The creature's voice cracked through the noise like a knife. The house remembers. The house collects. The walls trembled. Dust rained from the ceiling. The voices rose in fever pitch, chanting the same words. Ethan staggered forward, clutching his burned hand, the key's glow eating into his skin like molten metal. His legs shook, but he forced himself to move. "No," he croaked. "You can't have me. Not now. I'm not a child anymore." The figure twisted its head slowly, impossibly, as though mocking him. "You think age changes dead?" From the chair in the center of the cavern, the photograph flared again, curling into flames without heat. The image shifted. Not a boy anymore. Not even the distorted reflection of Ethan. Now it showed him, older, kneeling in the exact same position he was in now, mouth open in a scream. The moment was already captured, already sealed. The runes beneath his feet flared blindingly bright. The spiral pulsed, each ring of light locking tighter around him. Ethan stumbled, realizing it wasn't just a drawing. It was a trap. And then came the sound. A low, dragging scrape. He spun, his flashlight flickering back to life for just a second. Enough to see the figures pressing from the stone walls begin to emerge. Their hands, pale and skeletal, slid out from the rock, clawing at the air. Their bodies followed, grotesquely thin, stretched, their faces blurred but their eyes glowing faintly like dying embers. One figure whispered his name. Another hissed his childhood address. Another repeated the promise he had made as a boy, word for word, in his own voice. Ethan clutched his ears, screaming, but the voices came from inside his head as much as from the air. He stumbled toward the stairwell, but the steps were gone. The opening he had come through was sealed with solid stone. The cavern was the only way forward now. The distorted figure straightened, impossibly tall, its limbs scraping against the ceiling, its inverted face stretching into something wider than human. It leaned forward, whispering in every voice Ethan had ever loved. "If you will not stay as you are, you will stay as we are." The shadow figures surged closer, their blurred faces twisting, their forms collapsing and rebuilding in grotesque jerks. They reached for him with hands that were both solid and not, grasping his arms, his legs, his throat. Cold seeped into him where they touched, as though they were draining him hollow. Ethan thrashed, his voice ragged. I won't stay here." But even as he fought, the key in his palm burned deeper, sinking beneath his flesh, fusing with his hand. He could feel it anchoring him, tethering him to the cavern like a nail hammered in a bone. The figure bent close, its face inches from his own. Its breath was ice and rot. "You already have." Ethan's scream tore through the cavern, but this time there was no echo. The sound was devoured, swallowed into the house itself. The whispers stopped. The silence was worse. And in that silence, Ethan realized something far more horrifying. The house wasn't keeping him alive. It was making him part of it. The silence after his scream pressed down heavier than the voices had. Ethan's chest rose and fell, ragged, but every breath felt stolen, borrowed from air that wasn't his to take. The spiral beneath his feet dimmed, but the key embedded in his hand continued to glow faintly, pulsing like a second heartbeat. With every pulse, his vision blurred, and the cavern seemed to bend inward, folding at impossible angles. He clutched his head. "No, stay together. Stay yourself." But the whispers returned, not loud this time, not a roar. A trickle, gentle, insidious. One voice at his ear whispered his own name, again and again, soft as lullaby. Another crooned a memory, his father teaching him how to ride a bike, the sound of laughter echoing in a summer street. Another whispered his first love's voice, then his mother sobbing, the night he left home. Each memory was sharp, clear, real. Too real. Ethan staggered, clutching his temples. They weren't just speaking, they were pulling. Every whisper tugged at a different memory, yanking pieces of his identity like threads unraveling from sweater. He gasped as the summer day on the bike faded, the warmth gone. He tried to remember his first love's face, but it blurred, slipping into static. The cavern walls writhed as shadow figures pressed closer, their bodies jerking unnaturally. One leaned close, its blurred face melting into his father's. "Remember me, Ethan." Another leaned close, its hollow eyes flickering with recognition, becoming his childhood friend. "You promised we'd play forever." Ethan clawed at his head, shaking, screaming. "You're not real. You're not them." The distorted figure, the one with the shifting, upside-down face, tilted its head, watching with eerie patience. Its body stretched higher, scraping the cavern's ceiling. "What is the difference?" It whispered, voice thick with echoes. "If you remember them here, they are ours. If you forget them, you are ours. Either way, you belong." The words dug deep, more dangerous than any claw. Ethan felt his will buckling, the edges of himself peeling away. His name, whispered too many times, began to sound strange, like it wasn't his anymore. "Ethan, Ethan, Ethan." He pressed his burned palm to the stone wall, the key's glow searing against it. For a brief moment, the markings recoiled, shrinking back like worms exposed to fire. The shadows hissed, retreating a step. A spark of clarity pierced through the fog. The key. It wasn't just a chain. It was also a weapon. The realization lit a tiny flame of hope in his chest. The creature's voice rumbled through the stone. "Do you think fire saves you? Fire only makes you brighter when you burn." The spiral beneath him flared to life again, brighter, faster, spinning with dizzying force. Ethan's legs wavered, his thoughts scattering like broken glass. He bit down hard on his tongue, forcing the pain to anchor him. Through the haze, he saw the cavern stretch into a hallway of impossible doors, hundreds of them, each flickering in and out of existence. Some were broken, some rotted, some bleeding light. But one stood out, a narrow doorway at the far end, faintly glowing. An exit, or the illusion of one. He didn't care which. Gritting his teeth, Ethan staggered forward, every step through the spiral's blinding light like wading into a storm. The shadow figures shrieked, clawing at him, their fingers sinking into his skin without leaving marks but draining warmth, draining will. His knees nearly gave out, but the key pulsed harder, answering his desperation, flaring bright enough to burn the shadows back. He lunged. The cavern screamed with him. The walls shook violently, cracks ripping through the stone. Dust rained down like ash. The distorted figure bellowed in fury, its upside-down face twisting into Ethan's own, older, hollow-eyed, already consumed. "There is no door," it thundered. There never was. But Ethan's hand met the glowing doorway, and for an instant, he felt cold air brush against his face. Real air. The shadows shrieked louder. The spiral tried to drag him back, his body wrenched in two directions, bones threatening to snap. His vision blurred with tears and static. But Ethan forced himself forward, his burned palm pressed against the door, screaming with every ounce of breath he had left. "Let me out." And the door cracked open. Light, blinding, searing, poured through. The cavern howled, and Ethan was pulled through. Ethan crashed onto cold, damp earth, his lungs heaving as if he had surfaced from deep water. The light was gone. The cavern was gone. He lay sprawled in the overgrown grass, dew soaking through his clothes. Overhead, a sky stretched black and starless, yet he could smell rain in the air. For a moment, he couldn't move. Every bone ached as though dragged through fire. His burned palm throbbed, the brass key's outline seared deep into his flesh. He was outside. The house loomed behind him. It looked different now. Smaller, fragile, just an abandoned wreck in the woods. Its boarded windows sagged, roof caved in at one side, vines crawling like veins along its cracked walls. No glow, no whispers, just silence. Ethan's heart raced, but this time with fragile hope. He had made it. He pushed himself upright, trembling, clutching his scarred hand against his chest. He laughed, a broken, breathless sound that cracked in the stillness. I did it. I'm out. The woods were quiet. Too quiet. Not even the chirp of insects or the rustle of leaves in the wind. Only his breathing filled the void. Still, he staggered forward, pushing through the overgrowth. He needed to get back to the road, back to town, to anywhere that wasn't here. His legs felt heavy, every step dragging, but adrenaline shoved him on. Branches scraped his arms as he stumbled through the trees. After minutes, maybe hours, the forest broke, and the familiar stretch of the cracked road appeared. Relief flooded him. He had parked just beyond the bend. His car, his way home. The sight hit him like a blessing. He almost ran, his burned hands searing but ignored. He fumbled with his pocket, but his car keys weren't there. Panic spiked, then ebbed, no matter. He could hotwire it if he had to. Anything to put distance between himself and that cursed house. He grabbed the handle. The car door swung open, and his breath froze. The driver's seat wasn't empty. Someone sat inside, head tilted forward, face obscured by shadow. "Hello, Ethan." The voice was his own. The figure lifted its head slowly. Hollow eyes met his, set in a face identical to his own but pale, lifeless, stretched thin like skin pulled too tight over bone. The doppelganger's lips peeled back in a jagged grin. Ethan staggered backward, gasping. No, I left you there. I left you there." The figure leaned forward, hands gripping the wheel. His burned palm glowed faintly in the darkness, the outline of the key etched into his skin. "You never left." The wood shuddered. For the first time, Ethan noticed the trees around the road weren't quite right. They bent inward, warped, curling like ribs closing in. The sky overhead rippled, stars blinking in and out like broken bulbs. His chest constricted. The car, the forest, the road, none of it was real. The house hadn't let him go. It had only changed its shape. Ethan staggered back, falling hard against the cracked asphalt. He stared, wide-eyed, as the figure in the car opened the door and stepped out, moving with a jerky stiffness, limbs too long, too wrong. The doppelganger tilted its head, the same way the distorted figure had in the cavern. Its grin widened until it split the skin of its cheeks. "You promised, Ethan." Behind it, the house loomed again, no longer ruined but whole. Its windows glowed faintly from within. Waiting, always waiting. Ethan stumbled backward down the road, heart hammering against his ribs. His double stepped closer, its smile splitting wider until the skin at the corners of its mouth tore, exposing teeth that weren't teeth at all but jagged shards of bone. The burned key in Ethan's palm throbbed, and his vision wavered. For a fleeting moment, the doppelganger's pale skin rippled. Not flesh, but something else beneath, a shadow bleeding through. The same shadow that had stalked him through the cavern. He turned to run, but the road stretched impossibly long, bending into darkness that had no end. The trees closed in tighter, their trunks twisting like spines, branches knitting into a ribcage above him. The night sky flickered, collapsing into a low ceiling of cracked plaster. And then he understood. The house was no longer behind him. It was around him. He hadn't escaped. He had only stepped deeper inside. Ethan collapsed to his knees, trembling, clutching his head. No, this can't be real. I made it out. The doppelganger crouched low, face inches from his, hollow eyes boring into him. Its voice was soft now, calm, almost kind. "You never left, Ethan. You walked in 30 years ago. You only thought you forgot." Images flickered across his vision, like film burning through a projector. He saw his younger self wandering the woods, entering the house. He saw the shadows swarm him, the brass key pressed into his palm. He saw himself scream, fight, vanish while outside his parents searched, calling his name. But the boy never came out. The Ethan who grew up, the Ethan who lived 30 more years, was nothing more than the house's echo, given a borrowed life, bound to return. The ground shuddered. Walls erupted from the soil around him, splintered with rising, windows snapping open like eyes. The house built itself from nothing, swallowing the forest, swallowing the road, swallowing the sky. The spiral runes burned across the floor beneath him again, searing into his vision. And the figure, his double, reached out, pressing its cold palm to his burned hand. The two glowed together, the key mark fusing them into one. Ethan felt his body dissolve, piece by piece, as if the house was inhaling him. He thrashed, screamed, clawed, but his voice was gone before it left his throat. His name crumbled in his mind, slipping away. The shadows surrounded him, whispering, chanting, laughing. Faces blurred and shifted, too many to count. They weren't strangers. They were all who had entered before. Each had promised. Each had returned. Now Ethan joined them. His last thought before the dark took him was of the doorway he had seen, glowing at the cavern's edge. A cruel trick, a baited hook. The house had never intended to let him leave. And then the dark closed in completely. The whispers spoke one final time, echoing through the empty corridors of the house that had waited 30 years. The promise is kept.